What would it take to find out if there is anything beyond the ice wall in Antarctica? First, we would have to make our way to the ice wall. Antarctica constitutes the outer rim of the known world. In other words, Antarctica is likely the shoreline to all the world's oceans. Antarctica constitutes the circular shore of the known world. Antarctica supposedly has a diameter of roughly 3,400 miles, but we don't really know whether Antarctica is a smaller continent next to the outer rim, or whether Antarctica is indeed the shoreline of the known world. The second issue that we would run into is that independent travel is not allowed below the 60th south parallel in any reasonable manner to make any determination as to whether Antarctica is the shoreline boundary circumscribing the known world, or whether Antarctica is simply a continent a little north of the true but unnamed shoreline of the Earth's oceans. It could be an infinite plain that is uninhabitable at further distances, so we can't even go there to take a picture of a theoretical edge, dome, or any other lands beyond the South Pole. How much area is really being blocked off under the Antarctic Treaty System? Let's look at it from the alleged 60th north parallel, because this will give you an idea of the tremendous area blocked off to independent exploration. This is the area of the 60th north parallel. As you can see, the 60th north parallel includes all of northern Canada, Alaska, much of Russia, including St. Petersburg and other major cities, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, and Greenland. It's huge. Now, why in the world is this much area blocked off at the south? Do you really think it's because of penguins? The Antarctic Treaty was executed in 1959 and has been in place ever since. Think about it, no country had any real alleged concerns about the environment at that time. In other words, America, the USSR, and the rest of the major countries of the world remained partners in generally closing Antarctica throughout most of the so-called fake space race, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the fake moon landings, most of the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the Six-Day War, the Soviet-Afghan War, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Do you really think that the vast resources and strategic military benefits of Antarctica were put aside because of penguins? For nearly 60 years, regardless of worldwide conflicts, the Antarctic Treaty has remained. Travel to Antarctica is more difficult than you might think. So let's decide to take a theoretical trip across Antarctica to find the edge, if any. I am not talking about a trip to one of the few designated tourist locations of Antarctica. I'm talking about a real trek, pointed directly south, across the entire 3,400-mile breadth of Antarctica, and back again, to determine whether Antarctica circumscribes the known world, and to possibly determine whether there's an edge, a dome, or whatever, and then take a picture of it. I'm talking about repeating the trek of Admiral Byrd, and discovering that area as big as the United States, that has never been seen by a human being, on the other side of the South Pole, full of minerals and such, just waiting to be explored. I'm in the United States, and so we're going to examine it from the position of a civilian of the US. But the rules are going to be the same for all 53 signatory countries of the Antarctic Treaty, and everyone else, since these countries all enforce the same provisions. To begin with, we need to understand that anything below the 60th south parallel is referred to as the Antarctic Treaty Area. What does that mean? That means I'm generally not allowed within hundreds of miles of Antarctica from approximately 400 to 900 miles, without obtaining a permit. So now, the US government has recorded that some sailors have seen the mountain ranges of Antarctica at 300 miles distance, while sailing. Of course, 300 miles should be impossible on the globe, taking into consideration the existence of the curvature drop, but the 60th parallel is between 400 and 900 miles away from the shoreline of Antarctica. You can't see through that much lower atmosphere. In other words, I can't even see Antarctica from the ocean, without first obtaining a permit from the US State Department, or whatever department that controls that in your country. Taking a trip to the 60th parallel isn't going to accomplish anything, and so, we're stuck with getting a government permit. So let's go through the steps to obtaining a permit from the US State Department. This is the handbook of the Antarctic Treaty System. These are the rules that govern all signatories to the treaty. Beyond the fluff of the treaty language itself, most importantly we're going to look at the rules governing non-governmental activities located here, and some of the rules regarding the protection of the environment located here. Now, as a US civilian, this is the first form you'll have to submit to get approved to travel to Antarctica. The form itself seems rather innocuous until you understand exactly what is involved in the application process. In summary, Antarctica is treated as a giant natural reserve. Like a military base, all activities and pathways in Antarctica must be approved. This is unlike any other area in the world, except maybe a place like North Korea. So when I say that no independent travel is allowed below the 60th south parallel, I'm stating an admitted fact, well recorded as international law. The protocol states that all activities are to be planned and conducted on the basis of information sufficient to evaluate their possible impact on the Antarctic environment and its associated ecosystems, and on the value of Antarctica for the conduct of scientific research. Organizers should be aware that the environmental protocol requires that activities shall be modified, suspended, or cancelled if they result or threaten to result in impacts upon an Antarctic environment or dependent on associated ecosystems. If you visit Russia with a Russian visa, for example, are you limited to one particular neighborhood and its certain pathways? For those who visit America as a tourist, are you restricted to New York City, or are you generally allowed to travel around America? No one is just allowed to travel around Antarctica. All of your activities, vehicles, and pathways must be approved. But it gets much worse now. How many genuine people, watching this video, think that the purpose of seeing the edge, the dome, or the extended plain beyond Antarctica would be approved by the US State Department and the other myriad of agencies? Are you ready to litigate the matter when some State Department official arbitrarily says something like, "I think your expedition is frivolous and would be too damaging to the environment, especially in the light of the frivolity of the expedition"? I don't think a court will overturn that decision, especially when treaty law supersedes any rights you may think you have. So, we're going to have to come up with some fake expedition that will somehow get approved. Let's say we're a tree-hugging Luciferian geologist conducting a comprehensive analysis of the global carbon footprint on Antarctica and its flora and fauna. I think that sounds plausible, and so we could, hypothetically, fake our way in with respect to our purpose, but it will be tricky. Okay, I'm not advocating that anyone break a law. This is all theoretical. That brings us to the next point. Entire swaths of land are entirely off limits to all travel. These are called specially protected areas. It's pretty much guaranteed that no one is going to get a permit to go through a specially protected area. If my math is right, that's 1,373 square miles that are allegedly specially protected areas. I believe there's a distinct possibility that those swaths of land could be coordinated in such a way as to prevent me from going through Antarctica easily. So, all right from the beginning, my route may be extra hard, especially if mountain pathways are blocked and the areas are much larger than claimed due to likely globe distance shenanigans. But let's go ahead and assume we can navigate around those prohibited specially protected areas. Next, no motorized equipment is allowed at all for non-governmental personnel. Page 308 states, do not use aircrafts, vessels, small boats, or other means of transport in ways that disturb wildlife either at sea or on land. That seems kind of hard. Antarctica itself is supposed to have a diameter of 3,400 miles. That means no motorized equipment for at least a 6,800-mile round trip. That sounds pretty damn impossible, right? Especially if Antarctica is much bigger than what is claimed. What about sled dogs? Surely they'll be allowed. What's that? Sled dogs aren't even allowed? Okay, so our trip is now limited to a very long hike in insanely harsh conditions over an extreme rise of elevation. On a side note, Antarctica has the highest average elevation of any alleged continent, but I'm sure that's just coincidence, right? But, getting back to our insane trip, we not only have to walk at least 6,800 miles, mostly depending on when we need to turn around, we must also tread extremely light, as walking on plants in Antarctica is prohibited. I didn't know that plants grew in ice and snow. I can't damage plants or frighten wildlife on a 6,800-mile journey in a wilderness. I'm wondering if the Lewis and Clark expedition was limited by such requirements. Good luck traversing 6,800 miles on foot without damaging plants or frightening wildlife with no motorized equipment. I'm not saying that we couldn't figure out a way to get around these big issues, or maybe we could, just, theoretically ignore these issues once we get there, but again, I'm not advocating that anyone break the law. I'm saying that these are listed enforcement rules under the Antarctic Treaty System, and so, think of how easy it would be for one of the many international bureaucrats reviewing our application to deny a permit to trek across Antarctica based on this one possible excuse. Sorry, you're going to end up walking on plants and scaring birds at least one time during your 6,800-mile journey, and the Antarctic Treaty System prohibits such activities. Application denied. For argument's sake, let's just assume we're going to figure out a way to get around that. Don't ask me how. The next issue is, how are we going to carry all that food and fuel for heat? And don't think that the Antarctic Treaty System isn't concerned with how we store our fuel. The United States, itself, is roughly 2,500 miles across, so imagine the difficulty of hauling food, climbing, at extremely high and unknown elevations, and carrying all of your extremely warm gear and supplies across the United States, from coast to coast and back again, all on foot, with no food stops along the way. And don't forget, we're going to have to haul our poop as well. You are going to have to drag your poop with you on your 6,800-mile Antarctic hike, but it gets worse. Your poop is regulated by a different pseudo-government agency than National Science Foundation. Here's where you can learn about what permit is required if you wanted to dispose of your poop on your 6,800-mile journey, if you don't want to carry it. Could you imagine, for your next trip to France, and the custom agent saying, "Welcome to France, by the way, no vehicles are allowed, no animals are allowed, do not walk on any plants, and here's a bag for your poop. Be sure to bring it back full." If you don't want to carry your poop, you're going to have to get a permit from the National Science Foundation. Enjoy your stay. But here's another, and potentially bigger problem. What if there is no edge when you get there, but the conditions only get worse? How many years of supplies can one carry by a handheld sled and some skis? What if Antarctica goes beyond 3,400 miles? What then? What, do you turn back, and how do you prove it, because everyone will just call you a liar anyway? Any sane person right now would have to admit that our little trip is impossible. But we're not done. Going back to our Form DS-4-131, in addition to disclosure to other parties to the treaty, the information we provide may be shared with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to ensure compliance with 40 CFR Part 8 Environmental Impact Assessment of Non-Governmental Activities in Antarctica, as well as with other relevant U.S. agencies. This brings us to one of the most important issues facing us. What is an environmental impact assessment? No country, even North Korea, would ever require an environmental assessment before traveling across their country. Here's the definition of an environmental impacts assessment in the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations. The environmental review process required by the provisions of this part, and by Annex 1 of the Protocol, and includes preparation by the operator, and U.S. government review of an environmental document, and public access to, and circulation of environmental documents, to other parties and the Committee of an Environmental Protection, is required by Annex 1 under the Protocol. Well, let's see what the Committee for Environmental Protection says. Article 8 of the Protocol requires the parties to conduct environmental impact assessments for the Antarctic activities, and provides 3 levels of assessment, according to the potential impacts of each activity, and the procedures for environmental impact assessment are detailed in Annex 1 of the Protocol if a proposed activity is determined in a preliminary stage of assessment to have less than a minor or transitory impact and may proceed. If an activity is determined as likely to have a minor or transitory impact and an initial environmental evaluation was prepared. If an initial environmental evaluation indicates the potential for more than a minor or transitory impact or such impact as otherwise determined to be likely, a comprehensive environmental evaluation must be prepared. Draft CEEs are made publicly available and considered by the CEP, a comprehensive environmental protocol, which then advises the ATCM, and that's an Antarctic Treaty consultative meeting. Comments provided by other parties in the ATCM must be addressed in a final CEE, which is used as the basis for making decisions about whether and how the activity is conducted. It is the incomprehensive environmental evaluation that's going to kill our expedition. Here's the regulation, and this applies to all signatories including North Korea. Any operator who plans a non-governmental expedition that would require a CEE must submit a draft of the CEE by December 1st of the preceding year. Within 15 days of receipt of the draft CE, the EPA will send it to the Department of State, which will circulate it to all parties to the protocol, and forward it to the Committee for Environmental Protection established by the protocol, and publish notice of receipt of the CEE, and request for comments on the CEE in the Federal Register, and will provide copies to any person upon request. The EPA will accept public comments on the CEE for a period of 90 days following notice in the Federal Register. The EPA, in consultation with other interested federal agencies, will evaluate the CEE to determine if the CEE meets the requirements under Article 8 and Annex 1 to the Protocol and the provisions of this part, and will transmit its comments to the operator within 120 days following publication in the Federal Register of the Notice of Availability of the CEE. So now I'm sure most you probably just went brain dead when I read that, so let me explain it. First, our CEE, that's our Comprehensive Environmental Evaluation, must pass the EPA's initial review, not an easy task. Next, the Department of State, along with its Office of Ocean and Polar Affairs Bureau of Oceans Environment and Science, must review it. Next, it will be sent to all parties, that's 100 countries by the way. Next, your assessment must be approved by an international bureaucracy called the Committee for Environmental Protection. After their highly unlikely approval, the EPA will then publish it in the United States Federal Register. Now, why would they do that? Because any supposed private, tree-hugging group can now sue to stop you from going there. Once that is done, assuming you haven't been sued, then the EPA, along with all the other interested federal agency, whatever the hell that means, evaluates it again. Do you realize the amount of legal work this would entail? Do you realize how easy it would be for any one of hundreds of entities or thousands of bureaucrats to halt your expedition? Again, this applies to all countries. Do you know what the environmental impact statement costs? A typical environmental impact statement costs from $250,000 to $2 million, and those are a lot easier than this comprehensive environmental analysis required under the Antarctic Treaty. For us, the biggest problem is that you would have to incur the expense of the environmental impact assessment. Before you know it, you're denied, due to whatever arbitrary claim a bureaucrat can think of. Do you see how difficult this environmental assessment will be? How would one know the environmental impact on an area which you've never been to, and very little information would be available? With a normal environmental assessment, you'd be able to send an engineering firm to the location to make the assessment, with attorneys who would draft the statement. In this case, you can't send in an engineering firm all the way to Antarctica, and so you have to hire Antarctic experts who have been to the same places you're planning on walking through. Now, how many of those do you think there are? I say that we can safely assume that the price of getting an environmental impact assessment approved by the EPA and the international agency would cost millions, assuming no supposed private group sues you once it's published in the Federal Register. Do you have more than $2 million to spend for an environmental impact assessment? And then, what if the EPA or the Committee for Environmental Protection or one of the other agencies says no? Maybe that not enough information was provided. Are you ready to spend another $2 million to fight that in court? But you still have to have your purpose approved. Do you see the problem here? You would likely spend millions on getting the environmental impact statement, only later to have some official at the International Committee for Environmental Protection reject your purpose in Antarctica. You would truly gamble millions in this silly endeavor. Let's get to the final issue we're going to run into. 7 countries claim territorial rights to various parts of Antarctica. Argentina, Australia, Chile, France, New Zealand, Norway, and the United Kingdom all maintain territorial claims in Antarctica. I did find it interesting that the USSR never claimed territorial rights to Antarctica. Yeah, I'm willing to bet that my trip across Antarctica is going to need other permits from other countries based only on territorial claims, getting more permits or visas from other countries who have alleged territory in Antarctica. Yeah, that shouldn't add too much to our already strained budget. The Antarctic Treaty puts aside the potential for conflict over sovereignty, providing that nothing that occurs while the treaty is in force will enhance or diminish territorial claims, meaning that territorial claims trump. So, the next person who demands that you take a picture of the edge, or that anyone can go to Antarctica and see for themselves that it's a continent, be sure to point out what a damn idiot they are, and then share this video, because everything in here is fact, anyone can look up. I'll try to have all the links in the description below.